All right, it's 12:01 and we still have some people joining us and they'll trickle in and out, but I want to be very respectful of all your time today. We have a lot to cover and a lot of great conversation to have in a very short amount of time. We are going to end promptly at 1 p.m. Uh, my name is Ryan Keller. I'm the executive director for Thrive West Central. Formerly, we were West Central Indiana Economic Development District, and we have just recently updated our brand, and I'm very excited about that. But here at here at Thrive, we're real excited about collaborating on a lot of regional initiatives to support and empower all of our communities. Today, that's what this webinar is all about. It's focused on regionalism, and the topic of the regionalism today is how do we start to restore our communities together and get those kind of investments here on a local level. We have some really great presenters and speakers today. We have Eric Doden. He is the principal at Domo Ventures. He's the former CEO of Greater Fort Wayne and also the former president at IEDC. Eric, if you go ahead and wave your hand to everybody so they know who you are. There we go. And we also have one of his partners in crime, Eric Shields. He's the principal at Cardinal Strategies and former VP of Policy and Strategy at IEDC. And we have a very special treat as our moderator today. We have Mayor Clint Lamb from the city of Sullivan. Clint's been the mayor there at Sullivan for about the past 9 years, and he has been doing some remarkable stuff and transforming the city. And we felt that Clint would be an excellent moderator for this type of discussion. A few housekeeping items. If you'd like, keep your accounts on mute. If you have a question, please throw that into the chat. Myself and Mayor Clint Lamb will be moderating that, and we'll feed those questions to Eric and Eric. And also feel free to turn your video off if you so choose and just sit back, relax, and really focus in on the conversation and the dialogue. And don't keep your comments and questions to yourself. Please throw them into the chat. Otherwise, I think we're ready to get started, and I will turn this over to Mayor Lamb.
Well, thank you very much, Executive Director Keller. We really appreciate everything that you do. For those folks that don't know that might be joining us for the first time today, our organization, Thrive West Central, is our regional organization. And basically it covers 6 counties, and Executive Director Keller has been with us since August of 2019. So Mr. Keller, we thank you for all you've done. 2020, man, what a start, right? To come into a new position like this, you inherited quite a bit. And then also with I don't know if anybody knows, but there's this little thing called an international pandemic going on right now. So 2020 was a good chance to kind of do some housekeeping, rebrand Thrive. And just a quick explanation of Thrive. Thrive is a 6-county regional economic development group. It is community development assistance. We also have aging and disability resources and transportation. Sometimes as elected officials, we just focus economic development, ED, but there are so many things that Thrive does, and it takes us all, which I think our featured guests today are going to talk about that. We hear a lot about expanding the base, right? You hear that in political conversations, but I think that's exactly what we're trying to do right here in West Central Indiana. And thank you so much for the folks that have jumped in, probably for the first time. I didn't actually get a list of participants, so as you were coming on, I apologize if I left anybody out, but I would like to give a couple shout outs of folks I know who are participating. Mr. Andrew Forster for Governor Holcomb's office, thanks for joining today. Former Kokomo Mayor Greg Goodnight, who's done an outstanding job up in Kokomo over his 12 years. Now he's a former mayor, and he's still doing a lot of community development work throughout the state of Indiana. We have many pastors, religious leaders, business leaders, community leaders. Big shout out to Senator John Ford, who's not only an outstanding state senator, he does a great job as a staff member here with Thrive. We have folks from Okra, one of my favorite statewide organizations, the Office of Community and Rural Affairs. A lot of you folks in the 6 counties have probably utilized them many times. The Heart of Sullivan's organization, shout out to those guys. I see folks from Ivy Tech. So just a few things I wanted to start with there. But we're creating communities, right? We're creating counties here in our 6-county region. We're creating cities and towns, and we're doing it together. So without any further ado, let's talk about creating communities. And I know we have 2 excellent featured guests with us today that have done an amazing job of creating communities in their area. So Mr. Shields, Mr. Doden, who would like to go first?
Well, first of all, just thanks for having us. Eric and I have been really working hard over the last year and a half with Van Wert, Ohio, and helping them, a town of 10,800 people, really improve the prospects of rural communities. And so it's a real honor. And also I would tell you that we're really impressed. I mean, 64 people on a Zoom call for this kind of topic is an amazing fact for your region, that your leaders care and that they care about where you're headed. And my hat's off to you. We're just glad to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Shields.
I would echo those comments. And as Eric said, we've done a lot of work in Van Wert, Ohio recently. A quick little bit about my background. I really developed a passion for economic development and community development during my time at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, where we worked on a lot of different policy objectives over the years, including things like Regional Cities Initiative. And, when I went out on my own, that's something that I wanted to continue working on. And so, I'm really honored to be, considered part of this conversation today, and just excited to have the discussion with you.
Awesome. Well, like I said, we appreciate both of us being here. We did have an opportunity last week to kind of just touch base with each other and prepare for this today. And I think, and you probably agree, I wish we would have just recorded that discussion because I've been excited ever since then. And I think excitement and enthusiasm, as you folks mentioned last week, really it brings a lot. It's just getting things done, right? Not meeting just to meet. So Mr. Dunn, we'll start with you. Kind of wonder, you mentioned that you've been working in this community in Ohio. I also know you've been very active up in Fort Wayne. I do know that their regional initiative, or basically the road to 1 million, right? They put people and population as a top priority. So could you kind of talk about some of those things, what you're doing in the private sector, what you're doing for the community in Ohio, and how all that ties into your Fort Wayne region?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd like to just talk about is why. I think a lot of people ask, why are you so passionate? Why do you care so much? Why do you do what you do? And why is what you're doing with PAYGO USA important to you in your life? And, I think it's very important, for example, to make money, but I also think it's as equally or more important to do good. And so I think when you can combine the two, it can be really exciting. And in our particular situation, I grew up in Butler, Indiana, which is a town of 2,500 people, until I was 15. And then I moved to the large metropolis of Auburn, which was about 12,000 people for the rest of my high school years. And so I grew up in small town America, and I began to watch, as I was growing up, some of the challenges that we had in these communities with declining population. Often our core assets were in distress. And so if you really want to know my why and why I'm so passionate, it's because I really believe that every community has the opportunity to be successful. Every community has the opportunity to have successful economic development. And if we lead well, we can actually create opportunities for people that they may not even know that our leadership allowed. And so, that's my why. My why is because I grew up in a small town, and because of leaders that invested in me, I was able to do things in my life that I never thought possible. And I think that part of living a successful life is passing on that opportunity to other people. And so that's my why. And so when this opportunity with PAYGO USA came up, kind of what happened is as we began to look at the tools that were being used in cities like Fort Wayne and Indianapolis and Cincinnati, Ohio, and Dayton, Eric Shields and I began to realize that these tools could be used in small town America as long as we had scale. And scale to us means that you need to have somewhere between a $15 and $20 million project for these tools to really be useful. And when I say tools, I'm talking about the federal historic tax credit. I'm talking about state historic tax credits. I'm talking about new market tax credits, tools that these big communities have been using to revitalize neighborhoods for years. And so we decided that we would work with a community that approached us. We did not want to go out and sell PAYGO USA as a company, because our attitude is if you come to us, you're ready to do what's necessary to take your community to the next level. So as it turned out, a leader from Van Wert sat me down for lunch, asked me about PAYGO USA, learned about it, and asked if he could set up a meeting with leaders in Van Wert. And so we went and met with about 4 people, I think, Eric, if I remember right, and explained what PAYGO was about and how we thought this would work. And then after that meeting, we met with about 7 leaders and explained it again. It was at that meeting about within 4 or 5 weeks of that meeting that they decided to take $3 million from their private sector foundation, put it into a fund for the purposes of buying up the core assets that they had identified in Van Wert. So in simple terms, Van Wert identified 116 core assets. We did not identify that. We had them do that. We thought it was important for them to identify what was important to them. Of those 116 core assets, 16 of those were churches and government. They were in pretty good shape. And then of the 116 buildings, 100 of them were sort of a mixed use concept, with, by the way, a lot of them not being used except for on the ground floor. And of those 100 buildings, about 80 of them were in distress. And so they also then began to analyze who owned these buildings. And they discovered that the owners of these buildings were often either a single shop owner, or in many cases were remote owners from other locations. And there was no real strategy for this asset that they owned. And so we began the process of consulting with them and helping them identify buildings they should buy. And over the last year and about 4 months, we've helped them identify and buy 40 of the 80 distressed assets, and are working on now an $18 million closing on 13 buildings that we intend to close if everything lines up on July 1st. So that gives you a big picture view of kind of how we've come at this problem with our smaller communities. We try to do it through scale and participation with using the tools that are out there that already exist within state and federal and local government.
Yeah, you mentioned tax credits, and I know the city of Sullivan has utilized tax credits in the older buildings in the downtown. And I think everybody on this call today in the 6-county region understands dilapidated buildings, blighted buildings, and it always seems to fall on, on city government or whatever local government. Kind of like, what do we do now, right? We literally, I think everybody knows the building that has collapsed during the night, literally, and you just don't know. It literally starts to fall in. But you mentioned, as far as a little more detail on how this started, you mentioned the private sector foundation. So, we have a kind of elaborate how that applies to West Central Indiana, where we can tap into. We can definitely utilize tax credits, which are through the IHCDA, the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. There are other ways that you can get tax credits that local communities can, and partner with the private sector. How does local governments like ours really get in and to do these things, especially, quite frankly, not to be offensive, but with a culture that, with our organization of Thrive, I've always viewed it as, if you needed some assistance on something, you would contact the former West Central Indiana Economic Development District, which is now Thrive. But now, instead of just kind of calling them for assistance, kind of crafting a message and working together where we create the projects, not just ask for assistance on those projects. So the initial thought of some of your projects you're talking about, where exactly, more particular, did those dollars and resources come from? And then also, if you don't mind elaborating, I was really interested last week, you talked about how many sectors of the population that you have to bring together to make this happen.
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say that every community that we've been in is different. And but I also would tell you that a lot of people in communities say that, we lack the resources, we lack the money. And in our experience, it's very rarely a lack of money that is at the core of why things aren't getting done. It's often a lack of boldness. And so, but in every community, what we've seen is a different group that have been bold to step up. If you take, for example, Hillsdale, Michigan, who has talked with us now a couple of times, one of their big players in the room is Hillsdale College with a $500 million endowment. So they clearly can afford to participate in the redevelopment of Hillsdale, Michigan, and it would benefit the college for them to redevelop that. So that's why they're considering it. If you're talking about Van Wert, Ohio, their big anchor in the room that everyone had contributed to and was the community foundation. They had $80 million of assets, almost all of them invested in New York and on Wall Street. And So we challenged them to reconsider taking some of that investment off of stocks and bonds and putting it back into investing in their buildings. And they bought that very clearly and very quickly, and were bold about it. I mean, buying 40 out of 80 distressed buildings in 1 year means that you own your problem, right? And so that's the other thing that we've seen, is that whatever it is, and then in some cases, like you go to Grand Rapids, it's a group of high net worth families that have made a lot of money through Amway or some business, and they then took a chunk of that money and then start putting it towards redevelopment projects, and they work together on that. And so those are a lot of the entities that we find that have the resources. You know, either it's some kind of 501c3 or organization with an endowment, or it's a high net worth group of families who decide that we're going to take some of our money and reinvest it into the region, or it's you know, somebody along those lines that is trying to take on the bold effort of making something happen. And so that's what happened in Van Wert, and that's what's happening in these other communities. And so one of the things that we advise is that you find out who is the person or groups or people that can lead from the private sector. You know, we believe that the private sector has to drive this, because you can't just expect government to come in and fund, you know, your redevelopment. That's not rational. Taxpayers tend not to like that, you know, because they view that as enriching a developer or enriching a property owner at the expense of taxpayer dollars. What our experience has been is government is good at coming alongside the private sector, who is driving the initiative and who's putting, you know, the first money in to make things happen.
Sure, and to kind of elaborate on that, as you know, as far as the private sector, it's great to have philanthropical families in your communities. And I'd say all 6 counties in our region, we could all probably on this call think of somebody that maybe hasn't been reached out to. I also know that, you know, last week when we talked, we've had an issue here in our region, and also your region, you made it very clear, of playing well together. And, you know, kind of elaborate on that, where maybe nobody has reached out to these individuals to bring them together. A philanthropical mindset is great. Love of community is great. But quite frankly, that private sector, as you mentioned last week, and Mr. Shields, there needs to be a return on the investment as well. And, you know that you can't buy 40 buildings just to hope and do something with them. There needs to be somewhat of a return. How do communities come together, and all folks, government, private, come together to get a return on their investment, to make it worth their while, so to speak?
Yeah, so one case study I would share with you happened in Auburn with a family that are friends of ours, mine personally. We know them, we've known them for many years. And this family started buying up buildings and restoring them. Here's the challenge in simple terms. They would put $1 million into a building and then discover that when they were done with the redevelopment of it, it was worth $500,000. And so after 4 or 5 or 6 buildings, they begin to realize they're making millions of dollars of donations. And that was hard to sustain, because people just can't keep putting money in to have it be worth half of what they put in. Contrast that to what we've done in Van Wert with the use of historic federal and state historic tax credits and new market tax credits. The foundation can make about an 8% return. And so they're able to put in their $3 million plus bank debt, and then you add these tax credits, and they're able to make an 8% return. And so all of a sudden it's sustainable. And yes, they're not making a market return. Normally in this space, you would see a 15 to 18% return, but their focus is on a double return. So what they would say is, we want to make a little money, but more importantly, we want to make a difference within our community, or at least as importantly. I don't like to use moral. This isn't, I don't want this to sound moralistic. They just view a double return as an important part of their return policy. And so when you get people, either high net worth families or institutions or 501c3s that have a double return mentality, as long as you can show them some return, they will participate. And that's what we've seen in our experience in working in these communities. Mr.
Shields, invite you to jump in here and kind of, you've dealt with a lot of the things we've been talking about, and give us your perspective.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mayor. I think a couple observations to add some color to the Van Wert story is the leadership and decisiveness demonstrated there locally by their private sector. Eric talked about how, initially there were those initial conversations included primarily the private sector. It turned out in a small community of 10,800 people, most of those private sector leaders sat on the board of the community foundation. And so, as they started thinking about what are the financial resources that we have in our community to be able to sort of, Eric talked about buy our problem, right, which is dilapidated buildings in our downtown core. It turned out to be the foundation, and so it was a pretty quick process for them. We've talked about this group as being both deliberative and decisive at the same time. And a lot of boards and commissions and things like that, you don't really get that nice mix of deliberation, but also decisiveness. And they represent both. And so they understood the path that they were on as a community. They identified their downtown built environment was not adequate. Many of them have fond memories of, running up and down the streets and going to the shops and things like that when everything was full. And they, in recent months, the tallest building in downtown began collapsing, right? And so half the storefronts are vacant today, right? So they knew the path they're on, and so they looked at the situation and the financial resources that they had available to them, and they said, why wouldn't we own this problem, right? We now locally control our destiny. And so they view this, this is a bold initiative they're taking on, because the outcome we all want to see is a fully revitalized downtown in the next few years. However, I think they also recognize that even if none of that happened, there's still value in them owning the built environment downtown because they control it, right? It's not controlled by 50 different people who have 50 different standards of care and maintenance of their building, and 50 different capacities in which to do that. And so there's an opportunity now to preserve and maintain all of these buildings to the same standard in perpetuity because it's locally owned and privately owned. And by the way, even though it's a 501c3, as they're buying these buildings, they pay property taxes. And I don't know if that's a function of the way the Ohio property tax law works, but obviously the idea was never to take property off the tax roll. So I think that was another key factor.
And I appreciate that. Another point here, we talked on the call last week, and we kind of touched upon this before, but kind of discuss a little bit further the breakdown and how all this starts, where it starts 80-20 government, then it kind of goes to a 50-50, then the 20-80 private, and then basically, essentially, we're transcending that back into the free market. You mentioned the words government comes along beside. You talked about how we have to be bold and we have to think big and we have to, take some risks and, quite frankly, invest in ourselves, right? Before we expect others to come and invest in us. So what exactly does that mean, government come along beside? We know the tax credit situation. What about local government? Exactly when you say come along beside, what role is that and how does that transcend from that 20-80, 50-50 and the things I just mentioned?
Well, so one of the things that happens right away when you own 40 buildings is your conversations with local and state government officials becomes very different. In fact, I just talked to a key state elected official in Ohio and explained the story. And he said, wait a minute, come at me again. Tell me, how many buildings do they own? And I said, well, they own 40 out of 80 distressed buildings. And he actually made me repeat that twice because they're used to people coming to them saying, we need help. But they're not used to people coming and saying, look, we bought 40 of 80 distressed buildings downtown. We have a strategy. Here's a strategy. What programs or what things are available for us to be able to partner? Oh, and by the way, we've underwritten this project and we're only looking at an 8% return, which of course to most political people that are astute, that understand like return models, that's not an aggressive return model. That's a pretty modest return level. So in other words, the foundation is not looking to get excessively make excessive money off of this program. They're looking at making a difference. So what I've said to our private sector leaders is, government is better at responding to your initiative than just you coming and saying, this is from my IEDC days. If a community came and said, hey, we need money, but didn't have a strategy or weren't working together on a strategy, that was hard for us to find resources. But if they came to us with a strategy as a region, and they came to us with private sector engagement, where the private sector had either been acquiring or engaged in acquiring the core issue that they're trying to solve, that, we were bending over backwards to help those communities, because it's not often that happens. So that's the kind of mentality that we're advising as PAYGO USA, our small communities, to bring to the table. Let's not just go ask for help. Let's show that we have skin in the game in a significant way, and that we need a partner to get this process moving.
You mentioned PAYGO USA, and I apologize if we've talked about that, a few times. But can you kind of give us more information on PAYGO USA and exactly, it is your company, right? And that is your company, and just kind of give us a little more information on that.
Yeah, so again, I'm in the development world, and my primary development is Domo development, which develops apartment complexes in suburban tertiary cities. So a tertiary city would be between 100,000 and 1 million in population, and we're primarily focused on the Midwest. But when I was in this development world, I didn't see anyone focused on towns between 8,000 and 20,000 in population. And so I talked with Eric Shields as sort of an advisor to me, and as a partner, and we talked about forming PAYGO USA that would only focus on towns of 8 to 20,000 people, and then bringing the tools that we saw from the larger communities that they were using, the ones I've already mentioned, to our smaller communities. And so that's the formation of PAYGO USA. If you look at our tagline, it's the restoration of the American village is what we're really, about, and trying to create economic and opportunities within smaller communities and smaller cities, and then help them restore the core assets that they've identified. And I'm going to repeat this several times, because we don't think as PAYGO that we come in and tell any community what their core assets are. Sometimes your core asset or a problem you got to solve isn't in your downtown. Maybe it's in another section of your region. But you as a region ought to identify, from our perspective, what's important to you, what problems need to be solved, and what you're going to focus on and what you're going to own. And so that's our approach. And then what we do is we come in with general contractors and with partners that help apply for and obtain tax credits. And we bring all these tools to bear. And again, it's so that the private sector who buys the asset can make a return. And we work with them on the return they want. So in this case, the foundation said, we'd like to at least make 8% return. So all of our modeling is based off them making the return that they've identified.
We talked earlier about boldness, and both of you can kind of elaborate on here and how important that is really stepping up. Like we keep saying this, invest in yourself, being bold. The Riverfront project in Fort Wayne, that was a pretty bold initiative. The stadium downtown Fort Wayne, things like that. I remember having lunch with Mayor Tom Henry a couple of years ago. This has been several years ago, from Fort Wayne. And when a lot of these investments were made, I remember we were sitting there at lunch and he was so excited. And he said, Mayor, I'm really excited. So what's that? And he said, we now have a pharmacy downtown Fort Wayne. And I scratched my head for a second and I was like, wait a minute, Fort Wayne's the second largest city in the state of Indiana. And at that time, they didn't have a Walgreens or anything in the downtown, but yet folks were coming to live in their downtown, population density. Could you kind of elaborate on that? Really, they made a pretty bold investment. And then it's a prime example, or even something as small as a drugstore to be able to service the folks to live in the population in that community. Kind of talk about those bold actions.
Yeah, so when I got back to Greater Fort Wayne, Inc., after being at the state level, I had been, along with Eric Shields, we had traveled the United States and had studied places like Denver, Nashville, Austin, Greenville, South Carolina, Durham, North Carolina. We then went out to Des Moines and Omaha, and then we went to Manhattan, Kansas. And I think what blew us away was their boldness. And so when I got back to Fort Wayne, the thing I would say is I was really impressed with the leadership of Fort Wayne and that they had done a $60-ish million baseball park downtown. But then there had sort of been this 8-year break. And I felt, as the leader of economic development for the region, that we needed to put our reputation out there on the line for 5 bold projects over 10 years that equaled $800 million. And later, the press, in a private meeting, as I was, leaving Greater Fort Wayne to go back to the private sector, they said, "Hey, could we just say, like, when you announced those 5 bold projects, we thought you were crazy. In fact, we laughed in our room about like the audacity of it. But holy cow, dude, here we are. We have 3 of the 5 started." And so I think sometimes what we do is we undershoot what we can accomplish. And what we tried to do at Greater Fort Wayne Inc. was overextend what we thought we'd accomplish. So I'll give you one example. When I got back, the riverfront was slated to roughly be about a $10 million riverfront. And I just didn't think that was bold enough. So I had the Greater Fort Wayne Inc. team measure the linear feet of the river. It was, and we had 1 mile on the north and 1 mile on the south. And then what we did is it took the space of the $10 million riverfront, divided, the linear feet by 10 million, the 10 million by that linear foot, and then multiplied it by a mile on north and south, and it came up to be 100 million. So instead of talking about a $10 million riverfront in downtown Fort Wayne, we announced to the press that we were focused on a $100 million promenade riverfront in downtown Fort Wayne. And so now today, fully funded is $100 million for the riverfront in downtown, where maybe before we were talking about 10 million. And that's an example of taking a really great idea that, and bold, 10 million felt pretty bold, but compared to 100 million, there's a big difference, obviously, in what we're going to be able to do in downtown Fort Wayne with a $100 million riverfront versus a $10 million riverfront.
Sure. And we're talking about the second largest city in the state. There's probably a lot of folks on this call saying, well, yeah, that's Fort Wayne, right? They're the second largest. What did those investments in Fort Wayne do for Angola? What did it do for Columbia City? Just similar, I guess, let's put this into perspective. A healthy Terre Haute is very important for a healthy Clinton, a healthy Brazil, a healthy Sullivan, all of our counties and the surrounding region. And you're starting to see some investment in the Terre Haute area. So not only what does it do for the region, you mentioned your other story where there were 40 buildings or so that made the investment, but what did that domino effect did that have? Throwing that pebble, which in your case, you threw a brick into the middle of the lake and watch those waves. And how does that recycle itself? And how does that benefit the surrounding community of that individual community from that investment, but how Fort Wayne's growth has helped Columbia City, the others, and what can a growing Terre Haute do for us? And what can we do to assist and help us all play together?
Yeah,
and either one of you there, please elaborate.
Yeah, I want to let Eric take a crack at that, and then I'll give my 2 cents. But Eric, if you do me a favor, if you remember this, when you talk about boldness, what's Van Wert's per capita equivalent? Do you remember that number off the top of your head?
I don't know that.
All right. Well, you're explaining your perspective. I'll look it up.
Yeah, you might be able to. So, really the crux of the question to me kind of comes back to what's the point of regionalism, and the way that I view it is that regionalism, collaborating together within a region, planning, executing, comes down to it being really a tool to accomplish to allow your communities to accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish. And so I think there are tremendous benefits when you think about something as simple as advocacy for some specific item, whether it's legislative or at the local level with the city council. It's a lot easier to get the things that you want done when you are able to build a broad coalition. And that's in simple terms, to me, that's what regionalism is it's a coalition of folks working together towards really one overarching outcome. But within that, you have, in this case, a lot of different communities. They have a lot of different needs. And you can act as sounding boards off of each other. You can work together to help, advance each other's goals. Right. And so, I think that, we should also remember in Indiana, a high percentage of the population lives within a metro area, right? And so
70% of Hoosiers live in an incorporated city or town as well.
yeah, and so we can't ignore that, and so we need to make sure that those that especially the built environments in those communities are attractive and that they're compelling, and I think that regionalism is a way to get there.
Right. And regionalism, quite frankly, is really nothing new, is it? You know, I'm a prime example, just kind of a personal story. You know, I worked in Terre Haute for 10 years, but I chose to live here in the city of Sullivan, a community that I have that emotional attachment to. And I think everybody on this call today, whether they're a religious leader, a private sector, we all have an emotional connection to our communities. And, you know, my grandfather years ago worked at Pfizer's, right? And we all know on this call, many folks that worked at Pfizer's over the years, and the surrounding counties had a benefit from that. And you mentioned, you know, quality of life and building our communities where places they want to live. I mean, you see regionalism in different pockets, and the communities that have been playing well together and really embracing this basically were the ones that were chosen several years ago under the Regional Cities Initiative. And quite frankly, our area, we just kind of felt like we were just kind of getting started. And we had just kind of come together and we threw some things together. But it really was, to me, the first time that I really had conversations with other folks throughout the Wabash Valley here and in our region. And it's starting the discussion. And that's why we're here today, right, on this call. We're not going to have the magic bullet that's going to, you know, attack all the things that are going on in our communities. But it starts this discussion. And just another quick story. And I'm just going to mention him because I saw him pop on. Brandon Knaufel here in the city of Sullivan, young entrepreneur. You know, he's really engaged, and he uses the power of social media. You can kind of elaborate maybe on some of those, how our communities, he really understood that being just a successful restaurant in Sullivan wasn't enough. He looked at how many customers were in a 20-minute driving range, right? So it's not just always, and Ball State did a study here in the city of Sullivan where it showed how many customers were close to the downtown area. Citizens, potential customers, there were over 1,000 customers in a 5-minute walk of downtown. And as mayor, I didn't even realize that. So kind of, if you could, I'd like to get your opinion and thoughts on that. So the private sector thinkers and entrepreneurs, they're starting to think more regionally. Just a mere restaurant, the Acorn Grill here in my hometown, sees that and is capitalized on it. I'd like to get both of your thoughts on that type of thinking.
Yeah, so, you know, like when we look at, you know, a region, here's the analogy I would use, and every analogy has its flaws, but, you know, there's a healthy part of competition within a region, but it should be like sibling competition, right? Where we care about each other, we love each other, we're pushing each other, but at the end of the day, we have each other's backs. Because the reality is that we are competing in Indiana against the southern and western United States. We're not competing against our next door neighbor. So in Fort Wayne, I'm not competing against Indianapolis. I'm not even competing against South Bend or Evansville. I'm actually competing with them against the southern and western United States. And so if we have a stronger Indianapolis, a stronger Evansville, a stronger South Bend, and a stronger Fort Wayne, we're all better. And so, but at the same time, I want to push the envelope so that South Bend wants to compete with me so that they get better and we both get better, but I also want to help them. So I'm going to share anything with them, any information I have. And that to me is what regionalism embodies, because what at the end of the day, as leaders, do we want for our people? We want more opportunities for them to be successful, to have a successful life.
Sure.
That's really at the core of it, right?
And former economic development models almost pitted county against county. I mean, it was basically established where each county was going looking for out. Each county, and you had 3,000 counties in the United States. To where, you know, back to this, does it really matter where your job is, or does it matter where you live and bring your paycheck back home to, where you serve on your church committee, where you run for school board, where you coach Little League, where you fill your gas tank, where you eat, where you shop? I mean, is that really the key that what we should be doing in West Central Indiana? Continued community building. It's the basis of economic development, whether that's housing, whether that's trails, which I know here at Thrive, we have put together a big trail coalition. We're just kind of in the early infancy stages. I see some folks on the call today that have an interest there. So a lot of these great things are happening here in West Central Indiana. This is starting, And I'm so glad to see so many people on the Zoom call today, because I don't know if a lot of that stuff has been really, we haven't really done a very good job of telling our own story. You do an excellent job of telling your story for your area. But if we don't toot our horn and share in our wins together and celebrate our wins and successes together, nobody else is going to. So if you could kind of elaborate on some of those things, and also please focus once again on last week, you talked about, I think there were 4 or 5 areas that you suggested. The religious, which I was intrigued by that, bringing in churches and religious leaders, political, private sector, was it civic groups? I'm not quite sure. So if you could kind of talk about, toot your own horn and coming together, and also all the different factors. The mayor can't do it. The county commissioner can't do it. It's going to take all of these literally pitching in. Could you elaborate deeper into that?
Yeah, I think asking the question, what are our major challenges as a region, as communities within a region, first and foremost, and these are things that we touched on last week. Asking that question and answering it is going to be really important, because then that leads you into, who are the people, what are the resources available to begin addressing them. And so, some of those threats you touched on them already, right? People, because jobs are these days following people, right, to places. And so, I think that's something that we need to be really cognizant of in economic development. And so that's one piece. So there's kind of the risk of flight of talent, right? There's the flight of capital risk from our communities. That's something we probably should dive into a little bit more on this.
We always talk about the loss of people, but the loss of money. When that family, I love that discussion last week. When that philanthropical family or that business community, when grandpa passes away, the kids have already moved and their inheritance goes with them, right? So to speak. And I know maybe these are sensitive subjects, like, well, we shouldn't be talking about this and that, but it really does have an impact in our community. When the people leave, the dollars and capital go with them. So please.
Yeah. So that would be a second threat. Then we've already touched on the other one, which is, your built environment. What kind of condition is it in? In a lot of communities, especially smaller rural communities, that there are too many buildings that are dilapidated, decaying, empty, right? And you can't begin to attract people there until you begin to address that. And so all these kind of tie in together. But certainly, I think the one we haven't dove into a whole lot yet is really the flight of capital. And maybe Eric, you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the flight of capital is something that I wake up every day and think about because of my background and my business. And part of what I'm trying to do is attract capital to the Midwestern United States. So if I could maybe just describe big picture what happens with capital from my point of view. When a person sells their business, and let's say they sell it and they get what we call liquid for $100 million. I'm just going to use that as sort of a ultra high net worth family kind of starting point. Generally speaking, if they go to a financial advisor like Goldman Sachs, they'll be told put 80% of that into stocks and bonds, and then 20% of that into alternative investments. So your bonds will make you about 2.5% to 4%, depending on what profile you pick and how much risk and bonds you're willing to take. Your stocks make you 6.8 to 10%, depending again on your profile and your risk. Then you can do some mezz debt at 14%, which is just a fancy term for debt. You're on the debt side between bank and between equity, and then there's private equity, and that's usually 20%. Well, then what happens is these families are showed products from these companies that you can put them in funds, and they're real estate funds, and those funds tend to invest in places like Denver, Nashville, Austin, and the Sexy Six. And the Sexy Six is not a term, that's a term that's coined in the industry. It includes New York, Miami, DC, and then on the West Coast, LA, San Francisco, and Seattle. And so these are the communities that those funds tend to invest in because it's fairly safe investments. So if you have a family in the Midwest that gets liquid and then puts money into these funds, that money never comes back to Indiana or to Wisconsin or to Michigan or to Illinois or to Ohio. So what we're trying to do is encourage the families to take some of that alternative investment dollars and put it in specific projects. But to do that, they need to be able to make a return, and that is the flight of capital. So then what happens now over the next 10 years is we have this thing called the baby boomers. And the baby boomers have generated a lot of wealth, but they're also reaching the end of their careers. A lot of the baby boomers are in their mid-70s. And so as they pass away, and I've had friends that are baby boomers that have, their estate is often put into what's called a charitable remainder trust, because that avoids estate taxes. And that charitable remainder trust is controlled by a board, which generally consists of their family. And that family often doesn't live in Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, or Michigan anymore. And so they tend to start investing in their state or region that they live in. And a good example of this would be the Sam Walton family, who a lot of them moved to Denver. And so when Sam Walton passed away and his resources went into the charitable remainder trust, a lot of those resources got invested in opportunities in Denver rather than Southwest Arkansas. And so we're really focused in on trying to attract that capital from your region back to reinvesting in your region. And that will make a big difference in your ability to transform your region over the course of the next 50 to 75 years.
Next question, whose responsibility is it? Is it the private sector? Is it the mayor? Is it the county commissioners? Is it the city councilman? Is it the township trustees? Whose responsibility is it to bring together an umbrella of this, the non-for-profits, the profitable businesses or for-profit businesses, the business community, the industrial leaders, these families, the community foundations, government, to just really kick this start? Who do we identify in this area? You're talking about identifying those families, and also, once again, where does the religious community come in and play in all this as well? I mean, I liked what you said kind of last week, and I'm kind of where you said, you just do it. You just kind of step up and do it. It's nobody's responsibility to make your community thrive, right? It's no one particular, well, they'll get it. I'm sure they'll do it. You just kind of step up and do it. And what is it? Yeah, it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is permission. And I like what you said. Some people are going to get their feelings hurt, and some people are going to get their toes stepped on. And you can't be afraid to do those things, because if you don't do those things, quite frankly, your community dies. And nobody wants to listen to these things. But we're having a very frank conversation today. So if you could elaborate on that, once again, how do we tie in all of these factors together? You put them in a building, you throw them on a Zoom call. How exactly, step by step, do you do it? And once again, how do we bring the religious community into the fold?
So when Eric and I traveled the United States, we were privileged to be part of a group that met with, Eric, about 150 leaders around the country that had led economic development in the United States over a 20-year period.
Yeah, that's right. In about 8 to 11 cities across the country.
So think of it like a big listening tour, right? We just went out to learn from these people. And one of the questions that we asked was, how many leaders did it take to turn your community from where it was 20 years ago to leading the nation in economic development? And we kept thinking that they would say 50, 40, 60, consistently, no matter what size a community, by the way, whether we were in Denver, Austin, Nashville, or Manhattan, Kansas, which is about 40,000 people, they all had the same answer, and they were in different conversations. They said 5. 5 leaders stepped up, put the community on its back, and made things happen, and were bold and were transformational. Now, here's the good news. I see 63 participants on this call. If you guys can take it from 5 to 63, I think your odds of success are through the roof. But the point is that, these 5 people had to be a little audacious. And one of the things they said to us is that you have to have super thick skin. Because when you become bold and audacious, you take people out of their comfort zone. And when you take people out of their comfort zone, they sometimes get angry and mad or frustrated and upset or hurt. And so we're not out to hurt people. We're not out to make a man. That's not the goal, but it's just the reality of what happens when you're bold and you start stepping on some toes. And then another thing I would add to sort of finalize this is, when you have leaders, we all have egos. In my opinion, if you don't have an ego, you're probably not leading. The only question is, how well do you manage the ego? And so what we saw out of these leaders in these cities is that they had egos. They were big, bold people, but they also learned to work well together and play what I call playing the sandbox. And they managed their egos with each other for the benefit of the millions, like in Indiana, in Fort Wayne, I always talk about 1.4 million people relied on Greater Fort Wayne Inc. to bring their A game every day, because that was the 60-mile radius population of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And if Greater Fort Wayne Inc. did a great job, 1.4 million people benefited from it. And so I just reminded my staff all the time that we as a team are affecting 1.4 million lives. We can never forget that. And you and your region are doing the same. I'm not sure what your number is, but I'll bet you it's bigger than you think if you go 60-mile radius from Terre Haute. It's a big number of lives you're impacting by bringing your A game every day. But make no mistake, you will step on toes and you will cause people to say some pretty nasty things about you. And you got to have some pretty thick skin when that happens.
Or bash out your car windows or slash your tires, things like that. Just saying, I know some folks that might have had that happen to them. So, we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. I love the discussion, and we could literally be here all day. And I'd be more than happy to stick around a little bit longer and continue. But I do want to kind of turn to, we do have a lot of participants. We are definitely respectful of your time. A lot of you are probably on your lunch break. Hopefully you ordered lunch from your favorite local restaurant. And if so, next time you go in, be sure to go in and thank them for being there in the community and make them feel appreciated. And we appreciate you spending dollars in your local community. But Director Keller, if you could kind of pop in here and assist me. I've got several text messages coming in. I've also seen some chat. If you could kind of harness some of those questions and kind of help us out there. We've got some great feedback from a lot of our folks.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So looks like we have a question here from Deborah Ellis. She wants to know, how do we start as a community or as a region to really start to identify all these potential buildings and these investment opportunities? Where does the local community who has a large group of folks that care and they want to do something, where do we tell them to start?
So I'll start off there. I think first and foremost, I think it's important not to overthink this question, because my guess is that any community that you live in, if you were to ask anybody on the street, hey, what's the one or two things that you would change in our community, whether it's a piece of infrastructure or a piece of real estate, they would have a list of 3 to 5 right off the top of their head. And so, and I think that, there's probably agreement across the community on at least 2 or 3 of them, what they are. And so I think, we've alluded to this earlier, right? I mean, it's great to have a plan. But even if you don't, you can get started right away on cherry picking the really obvious things. And so, I guess, what I would encourage people to do is just walk the streets and look at the buildings in your downtown or wherever else is important to your community strategically, and just kind of make a list of, hey, this stands out in a negative way for our community. We should put this on a list of things that could be improved. I would start there in Van Wert, to use that example. That's what we did. Literally, we walked the streets and we said, look, that building's in pretty bad condition. It's vacant. Let's put that on a list, figure out who owns it, and see if they'll sell it to us.
Took a building inventory.
I mean, you can start that in, it can be really that simple.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? I know there's some concern from some folks that talk about, the lack of us investing in ourselves and how we use Amazon. I've seen some questions come in and all these things from outside, and we're not supporting ourselves. But do you see society kind of going back to staying local, whether it's local wines, local soaps, instead of getting that bottle from the West Coast in California, you do start to see a lot more local products, local farmers markets. And do you see society kind of returning to that, staying closer to home? And also folks like working from home. I mean, with with broadband and things today, and with the pandemic has showed us, just like we're here today, this would not have happened. This Zoom call today, we wouldn't have all been able to come together. So is that the silver lining, so to speak, through COVID-19, saying, you know what, there's no excuse now. You can jump on your lunch break, eat while you're watching this. How do we utilize those communications, come together, but continue, I can't stress it enough, to keep investing in ourselves and continue to support each other and not really necessarily be in competition with each other.
Yeah, and Mayor, I think that Amazon example is a great one because, if we can all begin,
packages are flying every day, right? Everybody on this call, and we're all guilty of it. My wife, not me, but those packages are. FedEx is loving it. UPS is loving it, and we see them all around our communities.
Sorry, yeah, and if we all start asking ourselves before we buy that thing off of Amazon, where's this? If I'm going to spend $1 on something, right? Where does that go, right? And could I spend that in my community and cycle that money over and over and over within our community, right? I mean, if we all thought about it in that manner, I think we have an opportunity to really support our small businesses and grow from within, right, organically. And I think that sentiment seems to be coming back.
How many communities, for everybody on the call, wherever you're at, how many communities have Little League or youth sports? And maybe it's, I just use Sullivan, for example, and I swear I'm not trying to stop anybody, but whether it's Joe's Italian Foods or whomever it might be that might be sponsoring that Little League team, in your communities, how many have an Amazon softball team? I mean, how many of those do you have that are actually giving back? How many times has Amazon donated to the neighbor down the street that has cancer and we have a benefit for? So it goes so much more than just a small business and economics. It really does. It's that emotional connection once again and supporting each other, and it goes so far. I just can't. And kind of in closing, something that's near and dear to my heart. Here in the state of Indiana, we have nearly 350,000 abandoned homes. What does that do when you're trying to attract the private sector to come into to Clay City, to come into Sullivan, to come into Carlisle, to come into some of these areas, whether it's Clinton or wherever it is? What does that do? And with 350,000 abandoned homes, we can have nice downtown squares, we can have good schools, we can have parks, but you spend most of your time in your home. And the amenities that home needs so you can work from home, to me, has never been more important. So I don't mean to go over. Director Keller, stop us if we need to be, but I just really think that the blight elimination, cleaning up neighborhoods and giving folks a place to literally live, not just, we always say, we want you to come live and work and retire and play. No, I mean, literally like the street you live on, getting down to the details, to the sidewalks, the infrastructure, and bringing up the emotional, raising emotions in your community and giving people basically, some hope. If you could kind of elaborate on that here.
Well, I agree. And I think one of the things that, you can't do with the internet is give people an experience. And so what I've seen around the country with our smaller communities is that the retailers are getting really smart about making their place an experiential, not just a financial situation. So if you want to know what I think, in my personal opinion, retail looks like going forward and in small communities and the small businesses, we're going to have to be really good at creating an experience that gets people out of the house into the shop, because they're getting an experience that's different than they can get from buying it on Amazon.
And do our local retailers, do they need to take a look in the mirror and say, look, they're not walking in off the street as much. I need to maybe take some courses at Ivy Tech, or I need to sharpen my skills where I can start shipping products from Sullivan, Indiana, or Terre Haute, Indiana, to New York and California instead of bringing them in. With the technology we have today, can we not run one of the largest corporations in the world from the third floor of a building in the downtown of a small community? Basically creating a place where they want to live. But do we have that mindset yet? And I think that's what we're trying to do, is come together and think, look, it's great. Hey, don't use Amazon, use downtown. But let's face it, not everybody's still going to do it. But if that retailer in your downtown does think, I can start shipping some of my products out, and then we can be the export. Thoughts
Yeah.
on that? Sorry, I'm hijacking this thing, going a lot of different ways, and I apologize. But I'm just so intrigued.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Eric and Eric finish this question, and then we're gonna do the takeaways, and then we're gonna have to wrap up here to be respectful of everybody's time. But Eric and Eric, take it over.
Well, Eric, why don't you give your final thoughts and I'll give mine, and then we'll go from there.
So I think, I can, in my mind, you can kind of distill a lot of this down to, some action items that anybody can take in their community, wherever they are and whoever they are. Right. And we've alluded to these already, right? One is, figure out who your community leaders are, right? I mean, make a list. There's going to be at least 3 to 5 of them. And for most of you, that's not going to be a very hard thing to do. And then go get them engaged and start asking these questions. What are our threats? And start making a list there, right? So what are your, using the Van Wert example, right? Where are your core assets in your community? In that case, it was their city center, their downtown. Make a list of them, right? And then figure out which ones need the most attention. And you don't need a plan to do this, right? I mean, you can just go do it. And then make a list of where the financial resources are in your community, because that's going to differ from place to place. In some cases, maybe there's a major company that operates their headquarters, right? Or maybe it's a philanthropic foundation, maybe it's high net worth families, maybe it's a hospital, maybe it's a university, right? But most of our communities are going to have one or more of those. And so once you have those things put together, you can start building a plan to actually implement. And so I guess I would just kind of leave it with those 3 action items. Figure out who your leaders are, make a list of your core assets, and then make a list of where your financial resources are.
And anybody can do it. All 64 participants can start that. Doesn't take one person. Mr. Doden.
Yeah, my parting thought, I think, would be that energy attracts energy. And when we studied this around the country and have participated, when you start cleaning up, they use a different word, but I'm going to use the word messes. When you clean up your messes and that creates energy, and that energy then attracts energy. So one of the things that's happened to me at church on Sunday morning when I go is my friends come up and say, hey, I just want you to know, because they know I'm actively involved in these bold projects. They said, I want you to know that my kids have left for college and they're now coming back at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they're blown away with the energy in Fort Wayne. And all of a sudden the narrative is changing from, hey, I'm really loving Chicago, to, hey, maybe, I'm getting married we're getting ready to have our first kid. We're thinking about moving back to Fort Wayne. And that can happen in every one of our regions. And here's what I tell our leaders all the time. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be improving. And if you're improving, and the faster you improve, the faster you're going to attract talent and energy to your community. And then things get really exciting. So I'm just excited for you guys that you're engaged, that you have 50 to 65 people that are really into making a difference in your community. And I'm excited to see what you guys continue to do as time goes on with identifying your core assets and then figuring out a strategy of how to acquire those and fix them.
You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep improving. I think we can close with that. What a great message to kind of leave today. Thank you so much for everybody being on the call. Once again, thank you to Thrive, to the board of directors. I wish I could have mentioned them all today. I know I saw a lot of them on the call. You do have a lot of folks in your communities that you don't even realize are working on your behalf every single day. We thank you to the staff at Thrive, who just works nonstop on these things and assisting our communities. The resources are there. Director Keller, I'm sure you would agree. The resources are there. How do we harness and put them together? And I'll let you have a closing comment. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. God bless you, and let's continue to thrive here in West Central Indiana.
That's right. Thank you all so very much. We really appreciate it. You can look forward. We'll send out more exciting webinars here in 2021. We're doing those monthly or every other month, depending on the topic. Really appreciate Eric and Mayor Lamb for taking time out of their day to chat with us and enlighten us. Lots of great things came out of this conversation, and it's going to spark a lot more development conversations here down the road. Just remember, if you need help in your communities, please reach out to us. We are a regional organization. We are focused on collaboration. We want to collaborate and connect everybody. And we got a lot of great resources and tools here. We can't do it alone, and we want to partner with everyone. So we're really looking forward to continued dialogue and taking this to the next level here as we embark on what is going to be a great 2021. Thank you all very much. Have a happy holiday, happy new year, and we'll be chatting soon. Thanks.
Merry Christmas. Thank you all.